This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to Silkie Carlo. She's the director of the British civil liberties organisation Big Brother Watch. She's going to be talking to us about the rapid rise of authoritarianism here in the UK, specifically now with the backdrop of the Palestine-Israel war. It's a bit different to what we usually cover, but definitely has an important overlap. Conflict, abusive government, and ridiculous politicians all seem to go into the same basket. If you like Popular Front, support us and get extra stuff at patreon.com/popularfront. First, to get into this, I think maybe let's just give a brief idea of the kind of creeping authoritarianism that has been happening in Britain, like over the last couple years. The way I've seen it, the way I've kind of kept up to date with it, especially through your platform, through Big Brother Watch, seems to me that there's many different things coming into power that seem very complicated, very like in the weeds when you read the bills, but then when you boil it down, it's like, oh wow, that's a really big deal. But because of various other things, you just don't really hear about it in the press the same way that you should if people were really aware of it, I think. So maybe you could just give us a kind of rough idea of some of the measures that have been brought in by the government in the last couple of years in Britain, which have added to the degradation of free speech, freedom of expression and what have you.
Well, the past couple of years have been most noticeable in terms of attacks on civil liberties. I think have been most notable in terms of a couple of really big bills that attack protest rights. And so we've had the Public Order Bill and we had the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, and both of them kind of turn protest into a privilege, like a nice to have thing if the police don't mind and other members of the public don't mind. And that's a kind of framing for what is a fundamental right, a protected right under the Human Rights Act. But I think sort of the other thing, a really big thing that's happened in the past couple of years is the changing attitude towards freedom of speech. And again, the same kind of approach is being taken. Like, it's okay to speak freely if you don't offend people, and if it's not problematic, and if it's not quote unquote harmful or could be deemed or read as harmful to someone. And because of technology, this is, to some degree, these very classic fundamental rights areas are being treated like a tabula rasa. It's like we're at ground zero. It's like all of the rules are being rewritten on when you can and can't protest, what you can and can't say online. And we could talk about some of the ways that technology comes into that. So I think free speech, free expression, protest rights have been under huge attack, partly because of the declining culture for free speech as well, and also because there's been more social unrest, and so the kind of the balancer from a government point of view to social unrest is just to clamp down on it. But I also think you can't read what's happened over the past 2 years in Britain without having the context of really what's happened over the past 23 years. I can only look at this in the counter-terror law context, going back to 2001, when attacks on civil liberties really got underway, and the casualness with which these kinds of bills came to be passed about what people can say, about how they can use the internet, about how they can be arrested and detained. So already we were working against the backdrop of some really extraordinary powers, notably mass surveillance powers. Like we all have the expectation that what we do is surveilled. We know that there's an extraordinary amount of internet surveillance, phone surveillance. We then saw how, of course, environmental protesters and activists have been classified as extremists. So they went from counter-terror to counter-extremism, and now we're in the kind of harm era. So you see counter-terror style powers being used for subjective attributions of harm. And not to forget, coronavirus happened in the middle of that, and there was the biggest authoritarian swing in the West we've seen in a generation. So it's a long-winded answer, but I think that trajectory is really important for understanding how and why we are today where we are.
No, I agree. One thing that really blew my mind was what you just mentioned, the police crime sentencing and courts bill. Well, then became the act. It was made into law. I couldn't quite believe how authoritarian that was when I went through the thing. Maybe you can just explain what that is, because most people, even in Britain, just haven't got any idea what it is. It's not their fault. It just wasn't really spoken about properly in the press or anything like that.
Yeah, true. And again, this was something that started at the end of COVID. So, people's attention was in other places. It essentially overhauls the rules by which people can protest. And so this idea came in about disruption and what disruption really is often the purpose of a protest, but disruption is criminalized in the bill. And again, we've got some quite loose definitions about what disruption is. Disruption can be noise. It can be causing people to feel distress or unease. And so these are really, really broad powers. There's also some powers that came in about protesters being expected to know a raft of conditions that may have been imposed on a protest. So protest is more like an organized activity. Normally if you go to a protest, a lot of people go to protest not even knowing who necessarily has organized it. They just know that there's a protest about an issue and that they're interested in the issue. But yeah, this kind of turns it into a permitted activity that you should be speaking to the police about, and then individuals should know what the conditions on the protest are. So we saw last week, for example, rules about a specified route, like you can walk down this road and that's your protest and that's what's allowed, and anything else you could face arrest if you veered off this course. So things like noise and movement and nuisance, annoyance, are deemed to be potentially criminal offences, which really gets to the heart of what is freedom of expression. If it isn't to do those things, the whole purpose of a protest is not that you're in some like designated police playground or like a protest pen and you get to hold a placard and be quiet whilst you're doing it. But that is the kind of view that the Conservative government has taken to protest, and that's the legal framework that we now have, as well as extended sentencing around protest offences as well. One thing that we did win in the various legislative attacks that there's been on the right to protest, is that they also wanted to impose something called serious disruption prevention orders. And if you were a campaigner who you didn't even necessarily have to have been convicted of any offence, but you could have this order placed on you, and it could mean that you would be made to wear a GPS ankle tag. And that really sent us mad, as well as you could then be subject to internet restrictions. So, potentially completely innocent campaigner, presumably one that's effective, because that's, it's important to say this is linked to intelligence gathering by police. They need to know who to impose these kind of orders on, who to target with these offences. You may never have committed an offence and yet be controlled in terms of your movements, whether you can attend processions, demonstrations, pickets, marches, and how you use the internet. And we did actually win our campaign against that, fighting tooth and nail, to be honest with you. But that kind of gives a flavour of how desperate the situation is in terms of how this government views the right to protest.
like bordering Minority Report?
Oh, lots of things are at the moment, especially with AI and the way that algorithmic decision making is being used, and the general approach that is being taken towards policing, and particularly with new technology. And I guess the thing about the minority, it's the prevention aspect, isn't it? And we're certainly seeing, particularly with technology, whether that's working into policing and really the public sector as a whole, is that there's a desire to use surveillance as a prevention tool, and even in some cases to predict criminality.
Yeah, something that really kind of made me kind of pause when I was reading the police crime sentencing and courts bill papers. There was a bit that said basically you can get arrested if you cause a nuisance via noise. Now, the thing they left out was who decides the attribution and the definition of what is disruptive noise, which versus what is just normal noise. And it turns out it's basically up to the interpretation of the police. So you could have a completely silent crowd. One person might shout once and the police can say, well, we've decided that that's too loud and you're causing a nuisance. Now we can arrest you. At that time, there was no provisions that said, like, you know, how many decibels is too loud. It was literally just up to the interpretation of the police. Now that it's passed, is it still like that?
I think the important thing to say with all of these powers, as you've just outlined, they're completely enabling. And how do you define a public nuisance? How do you define distress? And how much noise is too much? The origin of the noise offence is, you will probably know, there was a prominent anti-Brexit campaigner that basically stood outside of Parliament. In fact, still does. So he's been there for years, and he shouts all day, and it is quite annoying. But he's got the right to do it, and I think, you know, there's that feeling that you have, and I hope that tourists have when they go to London and they go to see Parliament, that democracy is alive. You will see people with flags, and you'll see people shouting and chanting or standing silently with banners and all sorts. And that's what makes our democracy feel quite open and accessible. And I do fear that is changing, and making laws like this very enabling and open and subjective law about noise at a protest, simply because MPs are walking past this person every day, is the worst possible way to make laws. Because, of course, then what we're left with is an enabling law that will be used in the way that police want to, where and when they want to. We've had a public discussion, or in the middle of a public discussion really right now, in light of what's happening in Israel and Gaza, about how differently certain protests are policed. And that's really a good example of how, throughout this raft of anti-protest legislation, it really means that police can decide how to police a protest, how to, you know, who to arrest and who to target, and when and how they want to use those powers. And I'm not suggesting that that's for political reasons. Sometimes it's probably resourcing reasons and whatever. But essentially, you know, regrettably, the situation is that now there are many, many, many things, acts of peaceful demonstration. And it's really important to say that, you know, these kinds of things we're talking about, like making noise or veering off a protest route, you know, are examples of people demonstrating peacefully. And that is being turned into criminal offences, which is really worrying.
Well, let's talk about that then, seeing as it is like very topical right now. Obviously, the Palestine-Israel war is raging. I mean, mostly now it's at the stage where Gaza is just getting bombed every single day. But the French government, for example, just completely absurd, gone bonkers, have literally banned pro-Palestine protests. I think Germany was talking about something similar. What is it in Britain that they're proposing, for anyone that hasn't seen the news or hasn't seen the headlines on the paper?
Well, this is interesting because we these protests are now happening against this backdrop of anti-protest law, and what we've seen over the past couple of weeks is, protests mostly going ahead without certainly without serious violence. But there have been some examples of activity that's quite clearly unlawful. So, for example, on the weekend, most recently, at the Palestine demonstration, somebody scaled scaffolding and threw fireworks, apparently. And there's a video that kind of purports to show a police officer helping the individual down from the scaffolding and sort of saying, "Off you go." Compare that to the vigil that happened after a young woman was murdered by a police officer a couple of years ago, the Sarah Everard vigil, where women were being pinned to the floor face down just for chanting in a park. They're clear that this is what I mean about the subjectivity, and it depends on the way in which, at a senior level, police want to approach a demonstration. What's interesting about what's happening at the moment with these protests is that the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in London has told the government, we don't have the powers to police this in the way that we think you would like us to. And for once, for the first time that I can remember, the Home Office has said, yes, you do, and we're not having it, basically. And it's interesting. It's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, because normally when we have these kinds of moments of social unrest and large protests, it's like night following day. The next thing that happens is that there'll be a bill curbing protest rights. And I think on the back of curbing protest rights like never before, legislators now, they spent so much time on this, they actually know about how extensive the powers are. And they've said to the police, we know that you do have the powers to deal with some of this stuff. And actually, even the right-wing press has been saying that as well.
Yeah, what I found particularly Orwellian, if you like, was I was in a petrol station yesterday and I see on the paper there Suella Braverman basically saying, like, how dare the police not arrest everybody for she said that everybody at the protest in the Palestine protest was like calling for jihad and stuff. From what I understand, people were saying Allahu Akbar and stuff like this, which is not calling for jihad. She might not like the sound of it and she might interpret it that way, but simply saying that is not calling for jihad. I'm sure there were weird, minimal factions doing weird stuff. Don't get me wrong. There's always some dickhead at a protest, bringing out the worst in people, or the worst person there turns up and makes the most noise. But she was telling the police, like, publicly, like, how dare they not arrest these people. When the state starts doing that, after then she's already given them the powers. It feels like, to me at least, like as a citizen that cares about being free, it's like, how much power is the police going to have under this person? It's like, are they now, not by choice, but kind of by being browbeaten? It's like, is that now Suella Braverman's like personal security force? It just feels very weird. You know what I mean?
Completely. And I think that's a really important point. And that's the problem with the subjectivity. But a lot of the time, people. I think what's slightly perplexing about this moment is that we've just come out of other, like, very censorious legislation, for example, internet legislation like the Online Safety Bill. And freedom of speech has been a very prominent topic in this country and in the US for the past few years. And so in the UK, for example, we have really extensive communications offences. If you cause harassment, alarm, distress, fear, that can be an offence. Speech that is grossly offensive, purposefully annoying or distressing. Certainly if you incite hatred on the basis of sexual orientation, religion, race, these can all be offences. And so, on the one hand, technically, could could some of the chants that are happening, not the example you gave, but some of the chants that have been happening over the weekend, could they fall under those categories? They probably could, but it's just a different demographic cares about it now than has done in the past, and so that is quite strange, working on this kind of thing day in, day out, and then suddenly seeing the script flip so quickly. But I mean, that's also inevitable, isn't it? And I think in the work that we do, we are completely cross-party across the whole spectrum, and trying to make people of all political alliances, allegiances, realize how important and how precious these rights are for them and for others. Like, protecting fundamental rights like freedom of speech and the right to protest are not really about yourself. I mean, you have to be advocating for those rights for the people that you disagree with, and for others and the people on the margins, in order to have the right yourself. And I think now, kind of unfortunately, the decline in free speech culture that we've had through some complacency, it has to be said, over recent years, means that now I think censorship is going to affect a demographic that maybe hasn't been paying attention to its erosion over the past few years.
Definitely. I think that's already happening. I mean, I remember going to one of the Kill the Bill protests. We were filming it at the time. We didn't really do anything with it. There was nothing kind of relevance in the end. All the kind of more serious protests had already been stopped. But there were people protesting, and they were like normal, like just normal men and women kind of going past and being like, get a fucking job. Why are you out here doing this? And don't get me wrong, there were a lot of people at that protest just to be crusty and drink cans and be like, yeah, I'm a revolutionary. But the vast majority of people were genuinely really worried about this, understood it, and were marching against it, as is their right, as is, in my opinion, as is their, your duty as a free citizen to be against something that will affect your freedom so much, whether it hits you direct right now or not. And the people that were saying like, get a job, like, I realized it's like, okay, so this thing of that will affect them as well, very much so. As soon as they have an issue they want to protest against, it's like culturally, I feel like the press, the government has made protesting seem like a thing that lazy people do, if that makes sense.
Of course. I've had some interesting conversations actually with Conservative members of Parliament who have said to me, they've never been on a protest before. Of course, they've never been. These are people that went to university, joined the Conservative Youth Club or Student Club or whatever it was, and then, maybe worked as an advisor and then went into Parliament or, went into business. They're politically engaged in a very, very specific way. They're very unusual people. And although they're really politically engaged, they're not in the way that the majority of the public is. And so one of the things that's really interesting about the COVID period is that it switched a lot of people on, particularly conservatives, to pay more attention to assaults on civil liberties than they had before, including taking an interest in protest rights. And so some of them had said to me, I've never been on a protest before, and I don't really, you're actually like approaching an understanding barrier of kind of what it even really looks and feels like and what the policing would be like. So it's hard to describe, but when they're legislating, it's all so incredibly abstract to them because they just don't know. And so it's very easy, of course, to demonize people that go on protest as being some kind of like other breed of person that they just simply don't understand. But I think what's interesting about the COVID years is that not just in Parliament, but in the public, a lot of people went to protests, cared about free speech, cared about censorship, cared about privacy and surveillance, that had maybe never done so before. And the fact that the the Kill the Bill protest that you're speaking about, and I was at some of those protests as well, you know, they were happening at the end of COVID, and I noticed a really different demographic to what you would have seen, you know, even 2 years before.
In what way?
In that there were so many more people, you know, this wasn't like it wasn't just the kind of undergraduate, you know, 19 to 23-year-old kind of protest. It wasn't just Extinction Rebellion and environmental protesters. There was also a much more, I would say, working class and a big section of the general public who are even easier for the government to demonise in many ways, and even actually for some other protesters to demonise. But so I certainly saw that, and I saw groups that had come out of COVID advocacy organising around protest rights as well. So they kind of moved from one topic to the other, and that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I have a kind of theory around that side of things you just mentioned there, where like some other protests demonize. There's what I kind of call like podcast left in England, where if the working class have some kind of protest, these so-called like left liberals, if it doesn't adhere to what they believe, and most of these so-called left liberals grew up very middle class in nice to-do areas, if it doesn't agree with them and their podcast politics, then they're immediately demonized and very, very snobbishly laughed at. Now, okay, some people might end up going on protests for one thing, and they might then read Telegram that says lizards are controlling the world, whatever. That's nothing to do with you, and it doesn't mean you get to then demonize and laugh at the one issue that they maybe are right on. You're just going to push people away. And I find that there's this almost snobbish look down upon thing where like protest, and ironically that kind of attitude sits very nicely with the police crime sentencing and courts bill, because it's like, well, we're the hobbyist protesters. When we want to write fucking off Tory on a twee little placard, we're right. But when you want to march for XL bully or whatever, you're a fucking idiot, you're a peasant again. And it's very ironic to see, you know, these so-called like leftists look at it that way. And if you say anything, the same people say like, oh, go and watch GB News. It's like, oh, it's really, you are so out of touch with actual working class people, the people that you think you want to protect, that you just have no idea, you know. And it's almost like a new censorship via bashing people like that. I don't know, it's something I noticed.
I'm so glad you've said that, because basically no one does. Like, no one talks about this.
I've said it and been attacked by these people. They're like, oh, you're right wing now, are you? Like, no, I'm not.
And
it's just
how revealing that they say that, and that this depiction of working class people, especially working class people who take an interest in politics or go to a march or you know, take an interest in an issue that affects them, and then immediately written off as like brutish, right wing, you know, ignorant people. It really does my head in. And that was very clear at you mentioned the XL bully protest. And yeah, I mean, I just saw, when I was online after that, I just saw masses of people taking the mick out of people, but it just you know, outright classism. Yeah, it was really barefaced, really, really horrible to see from the left. And you know, this is a long-standing issue. Some of the worst, you know, I've kind of moved across I don't know, demographics in my life. When I was younger, it's probably some of the worst classism that I faced is from left-wing campaigners that I did protest with. The kind of things they would come out with and say is like astonishing. And yeah, that still very much happens.
Popular Front is entirely grassroots and independent. Subscribe to our Patreon for hundreds of exclusive bonus episodes, extra video content, access to the Popular Front network, and much more. It keeps us moving forward, and you get lots of exclusive content. Subscribe at patreon.com/popularfront. Yeah, it's very odd. But anyway, trust me, talking about class. Let's talk about the internet stuff. There's a lot of technological and online surveillance going on right now in Britain, right?
Yes, we had. So, of course, in 2013, when Ed Snowden blew the whistle, we discovered that, unbeknownst to anyone in Parliament, that the security and intelligence agencies were collecting data on everyone all the time about an awful lot of what we do and what we say to each other, who we speak with, where and when. The extent of the surveillance is absolutely extraordinary. It's like turning the military inwards. Communications data is stored about our internet activities, phone communications, just passively without even really lifting a finger. This architecture means that most of us are, all of the population really, has a huge amount of data stored on them in records held by the agencies, more intrusive data than you would get than probably searching someone's house. And this is being kept passively all the time. One of the reasons that Big Brother Watch came to prominence is because we did a legal challenge in the wake of the Snowden revelations about all of this, the undemocratic nature, the fact that it wasn't foreseeable from the laws that we had that this would even be possible. And it wasn't. I mean, talk about shadow state or deep state, if you like. That is the closest example of really that being a reality, because it completely evaded the democratic process. No one in Parliament knew that this was happening and that millions and millions of public money was going on this. So we won the legal challenge, but the government passed a new law overhauling the surveillance framework in 2016 called the Investigatory Powers Act, which is eye-watering. They have so much chutzpah. It was like, not only are we going to put on a legal footing all of the things that we've unlawfully been found to be doing, but we're going to extend it. So now the agencies can do things like collect what they call bulk personal data sets. They could, if they wanted to, go to Facebook and say, can we have everything, please? They can take mass databases really from anyone, anywhere. It could cover stuff that addresses political opinions, health, mental health, sexual orientation, you name it. They can also hack electronic devices of an entire population if they want to. So it's almost like the only limit is the imagination, despite the fact that it's 350 pages long. These powers are really, really enabling. So, and there is a kind of discomfort with the fact that, for me at least, and our supporters, that we just silently live in an extraordinary surveillance state, and that's a really big issue. And as that passed, I immediately worried about the trickle down. When you have that kind of culture taken in state agencies that operate very secretly and very quietly, then you often see that start to manifest in other arms of the state or even other arms of society. And I do think that we've entered a phase over the past couple of years where people police each other a lot more and surveil each other, and of course censorship as well, including corporate censorship on the social media platforms. The online safety bill, which is the overhaul of kind of internet content regulation, is another lurch forwards. And we've seen similar happen, maybe some of your listeners, if they're in Canada or the US, Germany, Australia, there are legislative efforts, certainly across the Five Eyes and across a lot of the West, going in exactly the same direction, whereby governments are now putting legal obligations on the social media platforms to be constantly surveilling the platform, not just for unlawful content, although, I can explain why I don't actually, do I need to explain why private foreign companies shouldn't be policing speech?
Unfortunately, probably you do.
Okay, I will.
Yeah.
But also looking for quote unquote harm. So speech that is perfectly lawful, but could be deemed psychologically harmful in some way, totally subjective, that should be there should be an enforcement around that. There should be censorship around that. Again, of course, this lurched forward during COVID, because during COVID, the platform rules were that if an opinion didn't accord with health authorities at the time, then you could be censored. So, when Austria said people essentially shouldn't leave the house unless they're double or triple vaccinated, as it was at the time, if you were to disagree with that, then you would be in breach of the terms of service. It basically allowed no latitude for protest, even, everyone was locked in their homes. And that's now been formalised in law, because what the Online Safety Bill says is, first of all, it does deputise the companies to police unlawful speech. So they have a duty to look for things that could be deemed to break the law. Bear in mind what I said earlier about communications laws in the UK. Speech that causes harassment, alarm, distress, or fear can be against the law. Speech that is deemed grossly offensive or purposefully annoying or distressing. So, we have really delicate communications laws. We don't have a First Amendment approach. We have a human rights approach. And it's really delicate and nuanced. And courts struggle with it. People remember the big UK cases, Twitter joke trial, etc. Nazi pug. We've had some big debates about free speech online. And now that's being deputized to companies that are really, that they're not even in the UK. They don't have judges, they don't have juries, they have often, low-paid, traumatized workers that are being forced to look at horrendous stuff all day, and are then being made to make adjudications on this kind of thing. So that's the first thing that the bill does. It says, over to you on the policing stuff. There's nothing in there at all about actual police involvement with the kind of serious, bearing in mind that there is a lot of child sex abuse and on occasions, obviously terrorism proliferating online and all sorts. But the bill isn't about police involvement. It's not about law enforcement. It's about saying how the companies should be dealing with this stuff and eradicating it, brushing it under the carpet, deleting it. It's not actually about law enforcement. And then the other thing that it does is says that they have to enforce their terms of service consistently. And if they don't, then they could receive huge fines, multi-million-pound fines. So for a lot of people, that would sound like, well, fine, that's kind of what I expect. But then in the scenarios that I've described, like, for example, when you couldn't say anything that disagreed with local health authorities, or even, if Elon Musk decides, okay, now it's against Twitter or X rules to post the whereabouts of my private jet, as he did last year or earlier this year, that now almost has the same footing as our actual speech laws. So there's like an assimilation, a kind of corporatization of speech standards. If that makes sense, an abandonment of things that we've worked for, decades and decades to establish how to protect freedom of speech in a democratic society post, human rights frameworks, is all being substituted for this kind of Silicon Valley approach. Jake, I'm really sorry that with that retching in the background, you will have to edit out. I'm sure that if you can hear it, that's my my dog has woken up and just done this devil noise.
No, that's fine. We've noticed it particularly bad with Instagram, and there's more to it as well. Okay, there's all these legislations and threats of fines, but there's also the people that are in charge of it. They have political opinions, they have political alliances, and we've had stuff taken down. We haven't posted. We have like almost 500,000 followers on Instagram, and we've not been able to post anything for like 2 weeks because we were getting so many threats that our page will get taken down when we started posting up news on Israel Palestine. So they started taking all these things down all of a sudden, and there's the appeal button. So we said, all right, we'll appeal, and we looked through it, and we didn't break any of the terms of service. There's just not even an interpretation where you can say that. And so then we appealed that, and we mentioned that. So then the next time they took the post down, they removed the option to appeal. So now they're just taking down our posts, and we can't even say, hang on, you're wrong. And now they're threatening to take us off. And there's a political bias behind that. It's obvious, it's obvious which ones they were taking down. I mean, for example, a couple of years ago when we were posting a lot about when Turkish-backed mercenaries were sent in to sack Afrin, and they were, just pillaging the place, killing civilians, we were posting that a lot. And all of a sudden, all of those posts started getting taken down. And there were other stuff there that was a lot more tenuous. It's like, well, I'm pretty sure that was a political thing from whoever did it. These weren't being taken down by bots because it was reviewed by a person. So it's like, it's not only allowed social media companies to just be the cops, it's also allowed people working there to feel incredibly powerful and go like, I don't like that doesn't fit my political ideals, off you go, you're gone. I just think that's like really, really dark.
Yeah, that is really disturbing to hear. And it does make you think, the power is extraordinary, because when you're thinking about delivering journalism to 500,000 people and the impact of that kind of censorship, inevitably it will make people think about how they choose their next posts and how they frame certain information and so on. This is the thing about internet regulation and why it's so important, and about this about the power balance between the state and the big tech companies. I think the state's approach is, we want to merge those powers. We like the look of these censorship powers. We want to have a say in how they're used. When, in my view, the approach should be that the primary obligation really that the state has in this regard is to protect its citizens' freedom of expression. And that's just totally not what we're seeing. The upshot is that we're talking about a realm in which billions of people are accessing information, and those rules, simple policy change at a big tech company can affect what billions of people see. So really, you're shaping not just freedom of expression. You have the potential to shape thought, perception, and to seriously influence global politics.
Yeah. See, I think people laugh when I say it, but I've been saying for a while, I think Zuckerberg is like one of the most dangerous people on the planet right now, because he's even now doing this like buddy, I'm the friendly, nice guy. He goes on the podcast, he goes on Joe Rogan, somehow gets an easy time from these people that apparently liked free speech. He goes on the other fella, the guy that, I can't remember his name, he wears a suit all the time. And then, he's rolling on the pad doing MMA now. And it's like, this guy is instrumental in destroying independent media. I just can't believe it. Not only that, I mean, look what they did with like Rohingya. Facebook was involved. They're stealing all the data, but it does feel like, why not? Nothing ever happens. Do you know what I mean? It's like, what actually happens? Have you seen any? I feel like 9 times out of 10 they just get away with it. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, and annoyingly, the direction of travel at the moment, I have to say, in a lot of the human rights world, is towards what more censorship should the big tech companies do. That's the kind of general direction, is not to look at necessarily the imbalances, the excessiveness, the disproportionality, the abandonment of the rule of law in place of corporate terms and conditions. Strangely, and I think there's something to do probably with funding in this regard, Big Brother Watch is really an outlier in that we have stuck really, really firmly to advocating for a rule of law and human rights approach. We don't want to see terms and conditions being used to control what billions of people can say. And of course, there are legitimate worries about hate speech and disinformation and so on and so forth. But you have to weigh up the evils. You have to weigh up the wrongs. What's better, to meet those things head on with a free speech environment where you have counter speech, and meet bad journalism with good journalism, and so on, or do you say that this should just basically be corporatized, and we'll put all of our faith in Zuckerberg to have some kind of team somewhere that controls what people can say and when. I mean, it's just kind of so absurd that that's the position that we're in. But regrettably, the political currents, even in the human rights world, are towards what more can they do. And when I say do, I don't mean to allow people to speak and share information freely, but I mean to censor.
Yeah. It's a worry though that, I don't know, from my point of view, there doesn't seem to be anything coming up or anything in the future to kind of limit this. It just seems to be, this is how it is now. Or not even more than that. It seems to just be like, this is promoted, like this is okay now, so long as it fits the correct, like whatever's popular.
Yeah. And I do wonder if current events are going to change that. I think actually on a lot of fronts, I think in journalism as well, and the panic around disinformation, for example, is the fact that the way that censorship is biting in this moment is very different to how it has over the past couple of years. And I think that's going to make more people than ever think about this kind of information environment that we've built. I think so. I mean, if you look at, obviously you look at this from a journalistic perspective, and I look at it from a general kind of public freedom of speech perspective. If you look at, for example, one of the things that we've worked on is something we call the Ministry of Truth, which is the government's counter-disinformation unit. And they kind of work as a conduit between government and the big tech companies by flagging content that they don't like, which then is fast-tracked to the censors. So, they'll just pick out posts, whether it's stuff that could easily be, conflict is definitely in the crosshairs because we know that they've been working on Ukraine and Russia. We don't know if they're working on Israel and Hamas yet, but it's quite possible. So conflict journalism could easily be affected, but anything about the conflict really. So they'll find posts, videos, content, etc. that they don't like, and then send it to the social media companies and say this needs to be looked at, i.e., we think this breaks your terms of service, it's problematic in this or that way. That's been really cheerleaded by a lot of people on the left as some kind of essential function of government, which blows my mind. And
it's incredible.
Yeah. And by a lot of people, certainly in the kind of political class, not realizing the dangers. I just wonder if what's happening right now is going to change that. We've seen that, for example, around the disputed hospital strike in Gaza, that there's been a real struggle. And of course, in a situation like this, that is so urgent and confusing, very difficult to be on the ground, report on the ground, it's very difficult to ascertain quickly what the truth is and what's disinformation. And do you really want the government in the middle of that, and working hand in hand with big tech companies, particularly you've rightly pointed out that tech companies kind of have their own politics. Often it's the path of least resistance because ultimately they're profit making machines, but governments certainly have a political perspective. They're the least neutral actor in all of this, and they want to be determining what's disinformation and what's authoritative. They call it authoritative information, and I think that is a real worry.
Yeah, it's like letting the fox look after the chickens, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Very worrying. Is there any positivity? Is there anything that's going to get better?
Yes. I'm not always the most. I'm not. I'm not always the most positive person to speak to. No, I'm sorry about that, Jake. But I think the fact that I certainly have felt this over the past couple of, I think it's been really noticeable which countries in the West over the past couple of years have strong civil society. The ones that have good journalism and good campaign groups, keeping an eye on things, advocating, recording, documenting, and giving people information. It makes such a huge difference. I mean, we totally felt that during COVID. And I think the fact that the UK, I mean, obviously a lot went wrong, but to even be a country where we can say, yeah, we've had successful legal challenges against mass surveillance. We stopped the excesses of some of the censorship, etc. We're documenting what's happening in these regards. I think all of that's really important. That's what gives me hope and positivity, is that we've got a strong civil society. So whatever happens, and I think we all know in light of events over the past couple of weeks, we're probably looking at a rough couple of years, but whatever happens, there's positivity.
Yeah. And also I've noticed as well, there are groups will pop out from various places. For example, in Italy, they have, the press there is quite strange in terms of they'll just kind of go with the government line all the time, and there's not a lot of trying to hold people to account generally in the Italian media. In fact, journalists that try to do that will be bashed by big media that side with the government, like, how dare you try and do this. But then there's a group, for example, like Popular Front. We have like a French, they're called Iconografia, and they're young reporters basically going, actually, no, fuck that, we're going to do it. And even if people come at us and the big media comes at us, we don't care. It's going to be legit, it's going to be honest, and it's going to be an alternative. And now there's a lot of younger generation now that look to them and go, wow, that's really cool, actually. So there is another way. So sometimes I feel like it can sprout. Even it just takes, let's be honest, okay, Europe is way more authoritarian than people make out, but it's not Turkey, it's not China, not yet, you know what I'm saying? So it's like those things can still thrive. So when I get down about it, I kind of think, well, at least that group's doing this, at least that group's doing that, you know what I mean? And I hope that becomes contagious.
Completely, I agree. And yeah, I mean, thank God that groups like yours and mine exist, and it does feed into a kind of ecosystem. But you're right, I think at the same time we can't be complacent about, of course we're much freer than a lot of the rest of the world, but we totally can't be complacent about it. And that's one thing that I've really been thinking about the past couple of weeks as well, when we're seeing the resurgence of this kind of political polarization between these new political axes. When you look at Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, often I think that when we're talking about a free press and privacy and free speech, people, the complacency comes from people kind of being so comfortable with having had it for the past few decades. And we've raised the alarm about what happens when you don't have it, and what happens about when we kind of unthinkingly import Chinese surveillance technology and use AI in ways that some politicians say it might be authoritarian in this context, in this country, but of course here it's completely different. That's not the case. And I think, I as kind of, perhaps because the moment is perilous and those new political axes are clearer than ever, I hope that it does make people, politicians and the public alike, realise the freedoms and the values that we've built over the past few decades. They're not just abstract, they're not just academic, they are literally the line between us being free and in some cases being alive and not. There might come a time when people need to know what it is that they're working for and what it is that they're fighting for. And I just, in our generation, unfortunately, I think we cannot afford to be complacent about it.
No, I think that's true, but I think there's people almost have so much going on now with the just chaos in the country. Just talking about cost of living and stuff like that. I think it's very hard for people to even grasp the idea of it, and I think that's quite a worry. Like, I know that for example, like I know my mum and dad, even as a kid, were quite aware of, stuff like that. Poll tax riots was their generation. Our generation, it's like, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of it, people either they haven't got the time to care about it, or when they care about it, they care about it to post, and it's like doesn't get much more than that. It's a weird one. I don't know. I hope I'm wrong, but sometimes I do think, like maybe the next generation, then they'll actually do
Well, I
something.
mean, yeah, we do have quite a politically engaged generation in many ways, but of course, the pressure and stress that people are under, I mean, is a factor. One thing that I think of is that in a lot of the social movements across history, very rarely is it a majority of the public who's behind them. For those
Absolutely.
reasons, you need a committed minority of people to care and to pay attention. So, people like your subscribers and listeners have decided to pay attention to these issues, and likewise, with us, people that have decided to pay attention to UK civil liberties issues. And having a committed band of people is really what you need.
That is true. There's increasing things happening though. I see where, going back to the police, I just thought something happened to me where the police don't really even know what they are meant to do. So this was really weird. But a couple of years back, I had the police come to my house. I was like, oh, fucking hell, like what's going on now? And this bit of paper, and he says, oh, you run Popular Front. And I was like, what? Like, how does the police know what that is? I was like, yeah, yeah. And he said, well, you've been threatening people on Instagram. And I was like, what? And I thought about it, and I thought, well, we have like one of our lads, Caden. He runs the Instagram, and I know him. I was like, Caden's not been threatening anybody on Instagram. I have not been threatening anybody. So I said, all right, let's show me it. So basically, what happened was someone posted under Popular Front, nothing to do with us, just a random Instagram user posted to someone else, being like, I don't even know what he said, like, I'll kick your head in or something like that, or like, watch out, just some idiot talk, some tough guy on the internet type of thing. And I had to point out to the cop, I was like, no, that is someone commenting on a post we have made. That is another user. Like, do you know how Instagram works? And he was like, well, it doesn't look good. And I said, mate, it doesn't look good for you. You have got this wrong. Like, go away, whatever. Anyway, they call me up the next day and they're like, oh, just so you know, it's going to be a no further action. I said, excuse me, how in what world is it no further action? There is no action to take because it's nothing to do with us. It's on our page. That is not like, that's nothing to do with us. That's a random commenter who we don't even follow. It's an anonymous account. And he was like, well, it's NFA. I said, it's not NFA, mate. I said, you've got the wrong end of the stick. And he wouldn't, he was like, let's agree to disagree. I was like, there is no agree to disagree. You are wrong. But in the end, he was like, he kind of went, oh, well, anyway, just forget it. And I know for a fact that it wasn't an NFA because I checked and basically he just fucked up. But that was scary to me, that the police are coming to my door for a misunderstanding. Like, it just, that made me think, like, as all these rules were coming, I was like, wow, man, like, who is teaching the police how to actually interpret this?
That's yes, that's extraordinary. That's a kind of mistake that you'd barely be forgiven for if someone like showed you their phone in the pub, let alone it's gone to someone senior who's made a decision to just
Right.
dispatch to your house. And yeah, that's just mind-blowing. I think that is also important for anyone not in the UK to understand. The context in which these police powers are coming in is at a time when there's a big public reckoning with how seriously incompetent and in some cases actually criminal the police are. And I'm not saying that as a kind of from like a kind of radical activist perspective. I mean, inquiry after inquiry has found that, and just as you are, citizens that have to engage with the police for whatever reason, often finds that. I don't mean that in a police bashing way. I understand that police have a tough job, and it takes a certain person to want to do that, but there is a systemic problem, systemic racism, systemic sexism, and incompetence on a really worrying scale. And so having these huge powers over the right to protest, for example, and speech, at these really critical moments for humanity, it kind of ups the heat of the whole conversation around it. So you know that these powers are going to be used in that context.
I think people here as well think, well, it won't happen here, it's Europe, which is laughable. I mean, you're seeing people talking about democratic Western values. France has literally just banned pro-Palestine protests. I mean, in what world is that democratic? And it's like everyone's just like, oh, it's fine because Hamas are bad. Well, yeah, there's a lot more to it than that. It's really scary to see, like, okay, we'll just take one angle and then everything else can get to fuck. Like, we just focus on that. And that seems to be, in my opinion, it seems to be like a tactic as opposed to just like, panic. It seems like they just, well, France are pretty, Macron is very guilty of it. He did it with all the protests, and he would be like, well, all of those protesters are this because like one person is, you know what I mean? And it seems to be this kind of appeal to people that don't really want to look into what's happening, to just let them dismiss it for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's the worst possible thing that a country could do. I mean, of course, France does have that very split tradition of both having quite militaristic police and a population that loves to protest and will protest about just about anything. So, I mean, that is a pressure cooker. I don't think that situation is gonna end well. And when you say people don't think it could happen here, what do we mean when we're saying it? If we're talking about authoritarianism, it's happening right now, exactly. And the problem is, to use another analogy, maybe, unlike a pressure cooker, it's like a boiling frog, isn't it? To some degree, if you can't feel it, it's because you've become so acclimatized to it, which is almost just as worrying. This is an abnormal situation that we're in. People shouldn't be having knocks at the door from the police, whether it's because of people commenting on the journalist Instagram, or we saw these high profile cases of police, for example, turning up people's door to check their thinking about gender issues or whatever. This is not it's we treat them as we treat these things as though they're anomalous, as though there's just these aberrations from the normal course of events. It kind of gets to the point we have to say, actually, it's a pattern. It's more than that. It's a trend, and it's a change in culture, and now a change in law. So, I mean, it's an important time for people to use their voices. I think when you're worried about losing freedoms, on the one hand, that can be disempowering, and people might want to kind of close up and feel, one thing you do see in activist circles is sometimes nihilism, like everything's fucked, everything's lost, there's nothing to kind of fight for. But the right thing to do is to then just flex those freedoms more than ever. If you feel that they're being curbed, assert your rights, speak more loudly, use your rights, because that's kind of how we, use it or lose it. You have to protect them in that way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I am very nihilistic sometimes, but I do agree with you. And I think people need to remember as well, though, that like freedom, really being free in freedom of expression, freedom to be who you are, freedom to let other people be who they are. It's not partisan. It's not left, right. It just is, and it should just be is. People are allowed to have terrible ideas, and you can't then, as long as they're not advocating to violence and take away someone else's freedom. I think it's a very slippery slope to start then saying, well, I don't like his views, so we can't let him have them. That is just not how it works. I don't know. It seems I see a lot of that now.
Yeah, I think people who say that either don't have the motivation or the intellectual capacity to believe that they can win an argument. Because
I think
I mean, for me, both now and also growing up, often with a lot of points of view that I didn't agree with, whatever reason, that's how you hone your argumentation skills. It's how you come to really cherish the ability to speak freely, and to use platforms or whatever, because I mean that's how you convince people round to your point of view. You have to care, you have to be invested enough in the community that you live, or the world in which you live, to want to use your speech to deal head on with some of those like abhorrent views, and believing that censorship will do it is a fantasy. It never has before. Censorship is a prelude to an authoritarian society, not a freer or more equal one.
Yeah, I think so. Before we go, maybe just explain what it is Big Brother Watch does and how people can get involved if they want to.
So we campaign for privacy and civil liberties in the UK through public campaigns, advocacy and lobbying in Parliament, and we also do strategic litigation when we have to. We also produce research and investigations. At the moment, our big campaigns are trying to stop the proliferation of live facial recognition surveillance in the UK. We're also campaigning to shut down the Ministry of Truth, which I spoke about earlier, the Counter-Disinformation Unit. And we've got big reports on both of those things and campaign actions. So if anyone wants to find out more, get involved, subscribe for all the latest on these issues, you can go to Big Brother Watch on Twitter or X, Facebook, or bigbrotherwatch.org.uk.
Cool. And if they want to follow you, what's the app?
I'm at Silkie Carlo on X, which sounds weird, Twitter.
It sounds so weird, doesn't it? I'll never call it. I'll never get used to it. And that's Silkie.
Yeah, Silkiecarlo, and it is my real name.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was the Popular Front podcast. If you want more exclusive bonus episodes, extra video content, access to the Popular Front network, subscribe to patreon.com/popularfront. We're entirely independent and grassroots. Nobody owns us. Patreon keeps us going, as does our merchandise. You can get Popular Front clothes and accessories at www.popularfront.shop. You can also buy our various publications there, like the Popular Front magazine. We are censored on social media and streaming platforms, so please follow us and share our content. Watch our documentaries at youtube.com/popularfront. Follow us on Instagram at popular.front, on Twitter at popularfront_, and for uncensored updates on the world at war, follow our Telegram at popularxfront or t.me/popularxfront. If you want to keep track of my work, it's the same on all socials at Jake_Hanrahan. That's HANRAHAN. For all these links and more, go to www.popularfront.cc. The music in this episode was produced by Sam Black. Check him out at samblackpf.com or search Sam Black PF on Spotify. The intro music is by Home. Thank you to our sponsors. This episode was sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use a promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. If you want to advertise with us, email jake@hanrahan.tv. Thank you to the credit tier Patreons. They are Pengu, Jessica, Peter Cherry, Lupe Calderon Garnica, Cyril Geist, Thomas Giuseppe, Jake Fuentes, Viola Forvel, Christian Bustamante, Daniel Verdin, Margosha, Rohan Irvin, Ryan Barbadillo, VS, Brian R, Justin Katuna, Evan Pank, Bradley Hope, Wizard Actual, Benjamin Tupper, Chongus Bongwater, Siddhartha O, Damien, Cameron Collins, Matthew Dithley, Claire, Liana, Robert, Sean, Christianovich, NTHG, Ethan Zwick, Peter Nybratton, Gabriel K, AG Barcelona, David McManus, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Bradley Davies, No Dogs No Amsters, Brendan Crave, B, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, Adam H, B, Rambo, Larson 8669, Ivan Julien, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamond Steen, Michael O'Connor, Nicholas Butter, JD, James Kopinski, Jav, James Cully, Ethan Fitzmadrid, Ed Coulthard, D. San, Mike Barone, Scott Hopton, Liam Williams, DZA, Giorgio Arani, Vegan Straight Edge Global Cabal, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Michael, Neck, Freya Northman, Neba, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Avida Provost, Bike Lane Bowser, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, JL, Stephen Davila, Chad Walker, What Bitcoin Did with Peter McCormick, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Maurice Zumbul. Thank you all very much. Support us at patreon.com/popularfront.